Hello everyone, welcome to LTEC 620 Visual Design Session 5. In this video, we're going to cover 4 topics. First, we're going to celebrate the winners of our kerning and color contests. After that, we're going to introduce the topic of concepts about graphics. Third, we're going to delve deeper into the multimedia effect and how it might impact us as visual designers. And lastly, we're going to define several key multimedia design principles. So let's get started. First, our contest winners. As you all recall, our first contest was the kerning contest. The goal of this kerning game is to achieve a pleasant and readable text by distributing the space between the letters. 23 students participated or submitted their score, and as you recall, scores are from 0 to 100. The class average across all 23 students was 88.13 with a standard deviation of about 12.5. The minimum score submitted was 47 and the maximum score was an even 100. So, who won the kerning contest? Well, it turns out we had a 3-way tie. 3 people submitted a perfect score of 100%, and those folks are Avery, Janet, and Joseph. So congratulations to all of you. Thank you for leading the pack in terms of our ability to create pleasant and readable text by adjusting kerning. Now, the second contest was related to color. In this game, players had to use the color wheel to match a specified color. What made this particularly hard was the time limit. As you recall, scores were submitted on a 10-point scale, and as our class, our average was 7.42 with a standard deviation of just over 2. We had a minimum score of 1.3 and a maximum score of 9.8. So I'm going to actually announce the top 3 winners of the color contest. So coming in third place with a score of 9.3 was Morgan. Congratulations, Morgan. Coming in as our runner-up was Avery with a score of 9.7 on the 10-point scale. Congratulations again, Avery. And our winner of the color contest this time around was Carrie with a fantastic score of 9.8. Congratulations all. Thank you for your enthusiasm about playing these games and having a good sense of humor about all of them. Now, I do want to encourage any of you who know of other design games out there that allow us to practice different concepts or skills to please share. I've compiled a few here, such as Tricolors, which helps you understand the additive nature of matching specific colors. There's another game called Pixactly, which will test how well you know how to size a particular shape given specific width and height specifications. There's another fun game called Shoot the Serif, which is just a fun game to help you quickly identify which fonts are serifs versus sans serif fonts. And then if you're interested in learning the pen tool, there's a fun game called the Bezier game, which allows you to master the basic functionalities of the pen tool, how to create anchor points and draw curves. So feel free to share other games if any of you come across them in your studies. Okay, now I want to move on to concepts about graphics. And really here we're adding a new bubble to our Venn diagram, and you can see here it's labeled concepts about graphics. Now, before we can talk about concepts about graphics, I want to talk briefly about concepts about print. The definition of concepts about print, they are the knowledge of how one reads print and books and how they work. It is a pre-reading skill that children need to develop before they even know how to read. Now, some of the examples of concepts that students need in order to be successful at reading are listed here. So, for example, how to hold a book, how to open a book, understanding the correct orientation of a book, where the title of the book is, who the author is, where's the back cover. Other fundamental concepts about print include the idea that words are made up of letters, and that if you put letters in different orders, they make up different words. Another important concept is that spaces separate words and that punctuation is used to create different meaning with sentences. So these are all fundamental concepts about print. Now I'm talking about concepts about print in our visual design class because I want to underscore the idea that concepts about graphics or understanding pictures also have to be taught. And that's one of the big takeaways about the concepts about print is children aren't born knowing those concepts. They need to learn them over time. Now, a related concept before we get into the concepts about graphics is this idea of pictorial competence. And that phrase is defined as the many factors involved in perceiving, interpreting, understanding, and using pictures. And it's something that develops gradually over the first few years of life. Now you can see here in these pictures of infants, they are seeing pictures of real-world objects. Now what's interesting about them is the infant on the left and in the middle, they are actually trying to use their hands to pick up or manipulate the object shown in the pictures. And the child on the right is actually trying to drink from the bottle that he is seeing depicted in the picture. Now, I'm sharing this with you to emphasize the fact that children aren't born knowing how to understand pictures. It's something that needs to be taught over time. If we dig a little bit deeper into what it means to have full pictorial competence, that means you have both perceptual abilities and conceptual knowledge. For example, viewers with full pictorial competence should be able to see the representation itself and understand that they're looking at a picture or a representation. They should be able to see through that picture surface to its underlying referent. So for example, in the previous pictures, those infants seeing pictures of bottles eventually should understand that that's a picture of a bottle, not a real bottle, and that it actually is a symbol or it refers to a bottle in the real world. Thirdly, children with pictorial competence should understand the nature of the relation between the representation and the referent, and they should also possess pragmatic knowledge about how pictures are produced and used in society. Of course, these are all skills that develop gradually over time. Now, I share all of that with you to share these 8 concepts about graphics, and I'd like to walk through these one by one. So one of the concepts is the concept of action, and this is the idea that static graphics can be interpreted as dynamic action. So even though I'm seeing a picture that's not moving, that's static, it may be representing action. The second concept about graphics is the idea of extension. And this can be defined as the idea that some graphics provide additional information that is not present in the written text. The third concept is importance. And that's the idea that some of the information presented graphically may be very important, and it may even be more important than some of the other information on the page of a textbook. The fourth concept about graphics is intentionality. And this is the idea that illustrators and sometimes authors themselves choose or create graphics to accomplish a communicative purpose within a larger text. There's intention or intentionality behind those graphics. And a more sophisticated viewer of graphics will step back and ask themselves, what is the intent of including this graphic with this text? The fifth concept is partiality. And that's the idea that not everything in written text must be presented in the graphics. Some things are or do have a corresponding graphic, but some things don't. That's the idea of partiality. The sixth concept is permanence. And this idea is that graphics and printed text are permanent and that they do not change. Of course, this sounds very fundamental to us as adults, but toddlers and early age children do not understand that concept. They may expect the dog in the picture to move. The seventh concept about graphics is relevance. And that's simply the idea that graphics and written text, when they're presented together, are probably related to one another. And finally, we have the idea of, or the concept of, representation. And this is the idea that illustrations and photographs represent objects, but they don't have the same physical properties as those objects. And we saw that in the earlier pictures of the infants. Those infants did not understand that those pictures of the bottles could not be used or touched or manipulated in the same way that a real world bottle can be. So there you have it, the 8 concepts about graphics. I shared all of that with you because I think it's important to underscore how long it takes children to learn about concepts related to graphics. What I want to share here are some results on a study of 60 children in 5 different grades: pre-K, kindergarten, first, second, and third. And what the researchers did is they assessed all of the children in terms of their understanding of the 8 concepts, and they leveled them into 4 levels. So take a look at the legend. All the way at the bottom of the legend, level 1 are children who had full acquisition of none of the concepts up to 2 of the 8 concepts. The second level was full acquisition of only 3 or 4 concepts. The third level was full acquisition of 5 or 6 concepts. And then the fourth level, the highest level, was full acquisition of 7 or 8 of these concepts about graphics. So what did the researchers find? Take a look at the pre-K column. And as you can see here, in pre-kindergarten, the vast majority, 10 out of the 12 students, which is roughly 83% of the students, only had full acquisition of up to 3 or 4 concepts about graphics. In kindergarten, there's 5 students that seem to have full acquisition of 5 to 6 concepts. Now let's skip ahead to the third grade. Even in third grade, that only 5 of the 12 students tested had full acquisition of all 8 concepts about graphics. So what does this have to do with visual design? Well, it's important that if we are making decisions about what visual representations to use when teaching and learning in early childhood or elementary school, we have to keep in mind that we can't assume that children have the same level of sophistication in their understanding about graphics that adults have. And of course, if we are designing visual representations for younger audiences, we have to keep in mind some of these concepts that they may or may not have mastered, and that may alter how we actually present the information visually. Okay, so that's that. Let's move on to a brief recap of the Van Genuchen, Scheider, and Schuler article from 2012 and their emphasis on the multimedia effect. So if we come back to our course Venn diagram, I'm adding a new bubble here related to the when and why of the multimedia effect. Now, just briefly to recap from last week, we talked about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. We emphasized that multimedia is presenting words and pictures together. Talked about how multimedia learning is actually building a mental model from those words and pictures. And we also talked about some of the underlying assumptions of this theory. This idea that we have dual channels for sound and for sight. We also talked about the limited capacity of our working memory. And then importantly, we talked about this idea of active processing, that humans engage in active learning by selecting material, organizing it in their working memory, and then ultimately integrating it with what they already know, their prior knowledge. So selecting, organizing, and integrating are the steps involved in really trying to learn something that is presented in a multimedia message. Now, with that backdrop, what was quite interesting in the Van Genuchen article is this idea that we don't really know why people learn from multimedia messages. In fact, there's actually 2 explanations as to why the multimedia effect, this idea that people learn better from multimedia, from pictures and graphics than just text alone. There's 2 different theories. So one is outcome oriented. And this particular theory posits that learning from text and pictures results in a richer internal representation compared to learning from text only. In other words, when learning from text and pictures or multimedia, there are 2 representations of the same information. This, in turn, increases the chances of a learner being able to retrieve or activate that information. Because they've been exposed to it ideally in 2 channels, that increases the odds that they're going to be able to encode it and then retrieve it when they need to from memory. And finally, verbal and nonverbal information integrated with knowledge stored in long-term memory should lead to enriched mental representations. So those 3 points define or explain the idea behind the outcome-oriented view of the multimedia effect. Now, in contrast, we have the process-oriented view. And that explanation simply posits that information processing during learning is facilitated when learners study pictures. Why would that be helpful? Well, the idea is that learners automatically perceive visual spatial information from pictures, which is different than text. We can't quickly or automatically get visual and spatial information from text. Because humans are so good at perceiving visual and spatial information automatically, and we can do that with relative ease, it's easier to draw inferences from pictures, which frees up some of our cognitive resources that can be focused on other learning tasks. And therefore, there's kind of a net gain in terms of the amount of cognitive processing that's available for understanding information presented in multimedia. So that's kind of a summary of the process-oriented view. Now, importantly, the Van Genuchen, Scheider, and Schuler article distinguishes different types of instructional tasks. They distinguish conceptual tasks, causal tasks, and procedural tasks. So let's walk through these one at a time. Conceptual tasks reflects instances of concepts and their relationships. Of course, concepts relate to a set of objects, symbols, or events, and they are composed of and can be decomposed of their defining characteristics and relationships. When learners learn a concept, they are able to recognize, classify, or make predictions about an instance of a concept. Now, importantly, in conceptual tasks, the spatial arrangement is used metaphorically to represent non-spatial relationships amongst objects. The second type of instructional task is a causal task. And this has to do with a cause and effects chain that reflects a change in something and the consequence on something else. And when a learner has learned a causal relationship, she is able to identify why something happened and what will happen as a result of this cause. And in causal tasks, the spatial arrangement of the elements in the order of connection of elements in the picture map the spatial arrangement in the order in the real world. In other words, we want the arrangement of the elements in a visualization to map onto the same spatial arrangement that we would see in the real world. The third and final type is a procedural task. And a procedural structure reflects the temporal order and spatial relationships between actions that are intended to achieve a goal. A procedure is often referred to as a skill, a technique, or a method. And when learners have learned a procedure, they know how to do something. And of course, in procedural tasks, space is used in a mixed way because space can either directly map onto spatial relationships in the real world, or it can pertain to a more metaphorical use by mapping onto time. Now, why in the world is this important related to visual design and multimedia learning? Well, the point is, as visual designers, if you are creating a visual representation for a specific learning task, it's important to understand whether it's a conceptual learning task, a causal learning task, or a procedural learning task. Because the type of visual representation that you deploy will vary depending on the type of task at hand. And that is really the underlying idea behind the Van Genuchen, Scheider, and Schuler article. In the last section, what I'd like to do is focus on multimedia design principles. And this is really where visual design meets multimedia learning. It comes together in this robust body of knowledge called multimedia design principles. And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but you can see here I've added a new component to our Venn diagram, the multimedia design principles. And I'm just going to briefly go through 7 of them. And they're all important whenever we're creating learning environments that involve multimedia. So let's walk through these 7 multimedia design principles. The first design principle is known as the modality principle. And this is simply the idea that people learn better from graphics and narration than from animation and on-screen text. And the reason, of course, is that this idea that we have 2 channels. It's better to process audio information and visual information as opposed to overloading the visual channel with on-screen text and a really busy animation. So whenever possible, use narration coupled with a visual representation. The second principle is the redundancy design principle. This is simply the idea that people learn better from graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and on-screen text. You don't want the narration in the on-screen text or the text shown in the graphics to be redundant. You want to get rid of that redundant information. The third multimedia design principle is the split attention principle. This is really common sense, but it's the idea that people learn better when there is a single source of information. So whenever possible, when you're presenting multimedia and you're using text and graphics, you want that information to be integrated and close together as much as possible. You don't want to have learners, for example, looking at one source of information and then having to turn to the back of the book, for example, to look at something else and then go flipping back and forth. That flipping back and forth is splitting their attention, and that actually causes unwanted extraneous cognitive load. So whenever possible, use a single source of information. The fourth principle is the coherence principle. And this is the idea that people learn better when extraneous words, pictures, and sounds are excluded rather than included. In other words, when you're designing multimedia messages for learning, you really only want to have the essential information there. The idea behind this principle is that it's easier and more coherent if only the necessary information is presented. Otherwise, learners have to waste valuable cognitive resources figuring out what's relevant and what's not relevant. The fifth multimedia design principle that we'll cover today is the signaling principle. And the definition of this principle is the idea that people learn better when cues that highlight the organization of the essential material are added. And by cues, we can mean underlining, using headings and subheadings, arrows, dotted lines, anything that helps highlight the organization of the essential information is considered signaling, it is considered valuable, and it will help people learn. The sixth principle is known as the spatial contiguity principle. And the idea behind this principle is that people learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented near each other spatially as opposed to far apart. If you have a picture and you have a caption that goes with the picture, put the two together so that users don't have to split their attention between those two sources of information. You want them to be spatially contiguous or put together spatially. The final multimedia design principle I want to emphasize is the prior knowledge principle. And this is a little bit different than the other principles, and it's simply the idea that design principles that help low knowledge learners may not help or may even hinder high knowledge learners. This has to do with understanding who you're designing for. Do they have a lot of prior knowledge or do they have a low level of prior knowledge? Depending on that, you may need to make different versions of your visual designs so that it's appropriate for different learners who are coming to the learning experience with different backgrounds and levels of understanding. So there you have it, 7 principles related to multimedia design. Now there are many more principles. Now I want to emphasize just how significant an area of research multimedia learning is. So here I used Google Books Ngram Viewer, and you can see really about from 1990 up to about 2008, which is where that's all the data that's available, is the phrase multimedia learning has just skyrocketed. The number of occurrences has just gone up and up over the past 2 decades, and there's really no sign of that stopping. Now, I point that out for a couple of reasons. One, I want you all to know that this is a significant area of research related to both visual design and learning design and technology. So many of you may be interested in learning more about this. And secondly, I want to emphasize that there's so much more to learn related to multimedia learning and the corresponding design principles. And unfortunately, it's just more than we can cover in a short 6-week interdisciplinary course. So if you are interested, I've put up some really fantastic readings here that you can refer to. If you need help getting these, I have access to almost all of them. I have copies of the books. Just reach out to me and let me know. It's fantastic reading, and I believe fundamental to anybody working in the area of learning design and technology. Okay, folks, that is the end of session 5. Have a great week, and I'll see you online.